Hello and welcome to Mabinda TV. So for now, I like to look at the recent elections in Uganda. So the Ugandan president Yoweri Museveni has said there is no opposition in Uganda. Can you imagine the kind of arrogance that is? That is Ugandan president Yoweri Museveni, after winning with 71% of the vote, has said there is no opposition in Uganda. Even then, he has gave the opposition candidate Kizza Besigye, who is in dire medical condition, and of course, he is hounding Bobby Wine, the Robert Chagulanyi from his home. So, of course, now what do we make of that? That is, the Ugandan president Yoweri Museveni has said there is no opposition in Uganda. He says if the NRM supporters came out to vote and had a turnout of over 70%, then the opposition would not have gotten even the 2.7 million votes that they got. So you can imagine the kind of arrogance of Yoweri Museveni. So I think for now, what Yoweri Museveni needs to do is to know that he can be unseated from power. That's what he needs to know. He is not a gift to Uganda that can rule forever. That's what Yoweri Museveni needs to know. Is he a gift to Uganda that can rule forever? And I think that's something that he must be following through. I think in Africa, the opposition candidates are really facing a hard time, and that's why we need to level the playing field for the ruling party candidate as well as the opposition candidates, because the president, in his own free will, the president controls the judiciary, controls the courts, controls the army, controls the police, and that means that the opposition candidates are not having a fair play. The ground is not level for the opposition candidates, and that's why I think the opposition is losing elections in Africa. And if elections are not the way to change a government in Africa, then there will be military coups all over Africa, and that is something that uh, will will roll back democracy in the continent. Of course, look at the West African countries with the military juntas in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso. The military is ruling. Why? Because it is believed that you cannot change a government through the ballot box, through the ballot paper. You cannot change a government. That basically the elections will be sham. We are conducting sham elections. Really, I think the United States has not come out very clearly on elections in Uganda because, of course, Donald Trump himself is an authoritarian. So basically, do you believe President Yoweri Museveni when he says that there is no opposition in Uganda? So basically, the opposition party, I think, needs to rebrand itself. It needs to be a voice for the people, so that then so that the opposition can then be seen to be for the people. The opposition must be on the people's side, so that and then they become an alternative government for the people. And I think when the people know that the opposition is with them, then they will go to the ballot box knowing that opposition is with them. Look at, I think the recent opposition wins in Africa. You have in Malawi the former opposition candidate Lazarus Chakwera beat the ruling party candidate Peter Mutharika. In Zambia, the opposition candidate Hakainde Hichilema beat the ruling party candidate then Edgar Lungu. In Ghana, then in 2016, the opposition candidate Nana Akufo-Addo beat the incumbent president John Mahama. Of course, Mahama is back in power. Then in Nigeria, the opposition party candidate then that is Muhammadu Buhari beats the incumbent president Goodluck Jonathan. Then in Gambia, the opposition candidate then Adama Barrow beats the ruling party candidate Yaya Jammeh. So you can imagine there is opposition winning in Africa. In Senegal, the Omaya Faye beat the incumbent, the ruling party candidate, and of course in Botswana, the opposition candidate Duma Boko beat the incumbent president, and that is Makwisi Masisi. So you can imagine that you can see the opposition is making strides. The opposition, when the opposition builds on these small wins, that's how the opposition can win elections in Africa. But I would like the opposition to rebrand itself. I would like the opposition really to rebrand itself so that it can be, the opposition can be can be the alternative government. And I think really it is sad that the difference between the ruling party in Africa and the opposition party in Africa is that is not one of ideology, is not one of ideas. The difference between the ruling party in Africa and the opposition is in where they draw support from, where the region they draw support from, and that is really really sad that our elections are based on tribal voting, even for the middle class in Africa. You would think that the middle class has been empowered enough to be able to bring change in Africa, but that's not to be. The ruling party, the middle class is not empowered to look at the healthcare plan of our president, look at the jobs plan, look at the infrastructure plan, look at the education plan. That is not what the voter in Africa is looking for. The voter in Africa is looking what is the surname of the electoral candidate. That is what the voter is looking at. What is the surname of the electoral candidate? If they share the same surname as us, then we will vote them in because they are one of us. That is what. That is what our voter looks at. And so the voting patterns between the university professor and his illiterate cousin in the village is likely the same. What is the surname of the electoral candidate? If they have the same surname as us, then we vote them in. We vote them in if they have the same surname as us. And that's why then we continue to have sham elections in Africa. We continue to have elections that basically where the ruling party candidates always win, and of course, and I think you already know the really bad thing about Africa. The thing that brings us down is leadership. Look at all the resources we have. Look at DR Congo, $30 trillion worth of mineral potential. The whole of Africa, nearly $500 trillion worth of mineral resources, but we are not converting this to wealth for the people. Then you have paradox of plenty, where you have a country having Africa having immense mineral resources, but not translating to good fortunes for their people. And this is why I think that the ruling party in Africa, I think leadership in Africa has failed to convert the immense mineral resources, the immense natural resources of Africa into a tangible wealth for the people. And if that happens, then you can be sure that Africa could be the richest continent in the world. We can be the richest continent in the world if we convert that. Look at Japan, barely no mineral resources, but having such companies as Toyota, Toshiba, Mitsubishi, Suzuki, uh, all these Sony, Panasonic, having all these companies because the leaders realize that they have no other resource except the ingenuity of their people. And so, even for Africa, I would say that we need the ingenuity of our people, but that can only come from effective leadership. Africans are living by the doors, but remember, other countries don't want us. Remember, Donald Trump is already warning that there will be. Donald Trump is already warning that there would be the mass migration is bad economics for Europe and America. That's why he is imploring on the European governments to crack down on immigration. Of course, for Donald Trump, he doesn't know that basically America is the true inheritors of America are the Native Americans. So of course, even the Europeans killed the Native Americans to be able to take over their land and mineral resources. And of course, they had the first slave labor of Africa. That's what Donald Trump doesn't know, that basically America was founded on two scenes of near extermination of Native Americans and forced labor of African slaves. And of course, the Europeans were immigrants, they were settlers. So when Donald Trump says he is banning immigration to Americas, basically he is not the forebearer of America, but of course that a white American will not want to believe that. They say history is made up of conquest and counter conquest. As the historian and former columnist of the Daily Nation, that is Philip Ochieng, says, that is then history is made up of conquest and counter conquest. So basically, right now, how do we ensure that an incumbent president can be beaten? How do we ensure that an incumbent president can be beaten. That's what will bring meaningful change in Africa so that we can have a liberal democracy, not just a plural democracy. When we have liberal democracy in Africa, and that is how we are going to bring true change in Africa. We can have Africa prospering, we can have and then we can have all these Africans having a standard of living. We need to define the African dream. What will be the African dream? We need an African dream of maybe 5,000, $10,000 per capita. That's $10,000 per year. That's how we can have an African dream where an Africa is prosperous, was at least earning at least $10,000 a year. And I think that and then have a meaningful standard of education, maybe up to a college diploma, have infrastructure that can support the economic activities. And frankly, that is how we are going to define the African dream. This African dream must be inculcated in every African. Of course, it is not foreign from the American dream or from the Chinese dream. For the American dream, I think the American dream is built on owning a home, but of course that is slipping away for many Americans. For the African dream, I think it should be the near target of $10,000 a year. That should be a low-hanging fruit, and I think when you have people that are able to change the leadership through the ballot box, then we will get effective leaders that have an infrastructure plan, have an education plan, have a jobs plan, have a healthcare plan. That is how we are going to get leaders in Africa that are truly mean the best for Africans. And when we have leaders that truly mean the best for Africans, that is how then we can ensure that Africa is truly at the absolute bleeding edge of innovation. So, do you think an incumbent or Yoweri Museveni is right in saying there is no opposition in Uganda, and how can we enhance opposition politics in Africa? So for now, I think the bad thing about politics in Africa is that the election is hinged on rewarding supporters. So if the opposition has no carrot to dish, has no carrot to dangle to its people, then it breaks away. It basically folds up. You can't see. Bobby Wine does not have a prize to give to his supporters. So basically, maybe reaching 2031, he will not be having the same number of MPs that he has had. Of course, you have Uganda President Yoweri Museveni also has his son is setting sights on the presidency. That is General Muhoozi Kainerugaba. He is setting his sights on succeeding, and that means that that will be dire situation for Uganda when Muhoozi Kainerugaba, the president's son, wants to take over the leadership of Uganda, basically because his father is president. That is not a monarchy. Remember, when a democracy fails, basically, when a democracy is not renewed every now and often, it very quickly morphs into an establishment, and then from an establishment, it very quickly morphs into a dictatorship, and then an oligarchy. It very quickly morphs into an oligarchy, then a dictatorship, and then, of course, finally a monarchy. And so I will hope that Africa does not have a monarchy. We have presidents that are truly believe in the ideals of democracy. And I think when we can change leaders through the ballot box, then they know if they don't perform, they will lose out. And I think one of the things I would have hoped for is tribal-based voting. We need to do away with tribal-based voting. That is what gives presidents so much power, because they know they have certain regions carved out. And so countries where there are majority tribes, you have elections being won through the tribe. In Nigeria, you have the North versus the South. In Kenya, you have the Kikuyu versus the Luos versus the Kalenjin. In South Sudan, you have the Nuers versus the Dinkas. In Uganda, of course, you have Ankoles versus Bugandas versus Bunyores. In Zimbabwe, you have the Shona versus the Ndebele. And of course, it is only Tanzania that had elections had ideological based voting, but of course that innocence of Tanzania is now out of the window. Now they also have had tribal based voting in voting for Samia Suluhu back to the presidency. So you let me know, what do you think of Uganda President Yoweri Museveni saying there is no what do you think of Uganda President Yoweri Museveni saying there is no opposition in Uganda? Is that a true statement? Is that a true reflection of the situation on the ground? What does it mean for the larger African politics? So, bye for now till the next episode. Bye for now.